Vau Savas Reu TNT asterisk 64. Dundee Lefa TNT asterisk 64 Area 51 Aha. Area 51 Aha. Brains DBL. 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 Sable. Brains DBL. 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 Torture. Zombie. Brains DBL. 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 Torture. Chosurus. Brains DBL. Zombie. Brains DBL. Brains DBL. Brains DBL. Endman. Brains DBL. Brains DBL. Brains DBL. Brains DBL. Torture. Brains DBL. 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 Rainy. Brains DBL. Torture. Brains DBL. 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 Zombie. Brains DBL. Zombie. Brains DBL. 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 Fizzonlit. Brains DBL. Brains DBL. Brains DBL. Brains DBL. Brains DBL. Lane Plant. Mountain Crew. Brains DBL. Brains DBL. Brains DBL. Zombie. Brains DBL. Brains DBL. Brains DBL. Brains DBL. Brains DBL. Hustony Blue. Hustony Blue. Brains DBL. Brains DBL. Brains DBL. Brains DBL. Brains DBL. Fizzonlit. Brains DBL. Squelette. Brains DBL. Brains DBL. Coquelicot. Brains DBL. Fizzonlit. Brains DBL. Brains DBL. Brains DBL. Brains DBL. Marguerite. Fizzonlit. 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 Brains DBL. Brains DBL. Brains DBL. Brains DBL. Brains DBL. Fizzonlit. Brains DBL. Brains DBL. Brains DBL. Brains DBL. Brains DBL. Brains DBL. Fizzonlit. Brains DBL. Fizzonlit. Hustony Blue. Fizzonlit. Brains DBL. Lumino. Brains DBL. Brains DBL. Fizzonlit. Brains DBL. Fizzonlit. 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 Brains DBL. Brains DBL. Fizzonlit. Brains DBL. Brains DBL. Brains DBL. Zombie. Fizzonlit. 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 Brains DBL. Lumino. Fizzonlit. Brains DBL. Brains DBL. Fizzonlit. Brains DBL. 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 Marguerite. Coquelicot. Brains DBL. Brains DBL. Hustony Blue. Fizzonlit. Brains DBL. Brains DBL. Brains DBL. Fizzonlit. Brains DBL. Brains DBL. Fizzonlit. Brains DBL. Brains DBL. Brains DBL. Brains DBL. Gravier. Hustony Blue. Brains DBL. Fizzonlit. Sable. Fizzonlit. Cansuker. Brains DBL. Fizzonlit. Gravier. brains DBL, Sable, Isn't brains DBL, Isn't brains DBL, Isn't brains DBL, Cokelicot, Isn't brains DBL, brains DBL, Sable, brains DBL, Cokelicot, brains DBL, brains DBL, brains DBL, Isn't Cansuker, brains DBL, brains DBL, brains DBL, Cansuker, Isn't brains DBL, Cansuker, brains DBL, Sable, brains DBL, Pivoine, Cansuker, brains DBL, 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 Cansuker, brains DBL, brains DBL, brains DBL, brains DBL, brains DBL, Pivoine, brains DBL, Pivoine, Lumino, Bravier, Pivoine, brains DBL, Noi, brains DBL, brains DBL, Bravier, Pivoine, brains DBL, Pivoine, Noi, Bravier, Rainy, brains DBL, brains DBL, Bravier, brains DBL, brains DBL, Lumino, brains DBL, Bravier, brains DBL, Bravier, Noi, Pivoine, brains DBL, brains DBL, brains DBL, brains DBL, brains DBL, Pivoine, Zombie, Pivoine, Rainy, brains DBL, Pivoine, brains DBL, brains DBL, brains DBL, Rainy, Noi, Candidate, Bravier, brains DBL, brains DBL, Pivoine, brains DBL, Zombie, brains DBL, Lumino, brains DBL, brains DBL, brains DBL, Pivoine, brains DBL, Lumino, Candidate, brains DBL, Zombie, brains DBL, brains DBL, Cokelicot, brains DBL, Candidate, brains DBL, Rosier, Zombie,